A very warm welcome and a good morning to all of you, and thank you so much, everybody, for your patience. It is my very great pleasure to be back at this WISH conference. My name is Stephen Sacker. Some of you may know me as the guy who presents the Hard Talk show on BBC television, which makes me seem a little bit grumpy, I know, but honestly, I'm not that grumpy. And I'm certainly not feeling grumpy today because I've got a wonderful panel with me to kick off this session, which is all about what we can learn from the COVID pandemic. We're calling it a new era for vaccine innovation, harnessing the lessons learned from COVID-19. And I'm personally so very mindful that as a regular, very privileged participant in WISH conferences, that this is the first in the flesh WISH conference that has been held here in Qatar since the COVID pandemic. And when we think what the world has been through over the last 2 years and more, and how it became impossible to conduct this sort of event face-to-face, people mixing, networking, how lucky we are that science delivered us from what was potentially a truly catastrophic global situation. If you think back to early 2020, when we had no idea whether it was realistic to think of a vaccine being developed within a fairly short time frame, indeed many people feared it was entirely unrealistic. It did seem as though the way the world worked was facing a fundamental challenge. Well, here we are. We're back in Qatar. We're back at WISH, and we have, as I say, many reasons to be thankful. But we do need to think about how the world handled the pandemic, the lessons to be learned, and they're not all positive. There were some very difficult challenges about not just the science, but about the politics of dealing with COVID-19, the very practical issues of rolling out a vaccine after it had been developed, ensuring equity in availability of the vaccine, and also thinking about how we create systems which are better able to cope, manage, handle future pandemics. So all of that is up for discussion in the next hour and more. I should say before I introduce our wonderful panel and get the conversation going, we absolutely want you guys to be involved. Those of you, and I hope it's all of you, who've downloaded the WISH app, you can go to the chat box on the app and you can present your questions there, and they will be filtered through to me and my trusty phone here. So that's one way of doing it. Another, perhaps more human way of doing it is simply to put up your hand, because in the course of our conversation, I'm going to be scanning the audience, all of you, and if you've got your hand up, I promise you I will bring you into the conversation, because it's very important that this is interactive. You know, when we have an hour of conversation, it can be a little bit dull if you're listening but not involved, and I absolutely want you to be involved. So if you have questions, and goodness knows this is a wonderful panel and an opportunity to put questions to people with vast experience and great insight, just stick up a hand and I will come to you. So with that in mind, let me introduce my panel. I'll just start by going along the line. So at that end, give a warm welcome to, well, actually, give them all a warm welcome at the very end. Don't applaud wildly for each one of them. It'll take too long. They all deserve it, but let's just save it for the end. So we have Dr. Richard Hatchett, who is CEO of CEPI, which many of you will know stands for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations. CEPI, a very important body in the sort of last 2 years dealing with COVID. Next to Richard is Dr. Jimena Garzón Villalba, who was Ecuador's Minister of Health until recently. She continues to be a senior advisor to the President of Ecuador, and we're going to drill down into Ecuador's experience handling COVID. Next to Jimena is Professor Dame Sarah Gilbert. Now, Sarah, again, has a hugely important story to tell and role played in dealing with COVID. She holds the Syed Professorship in Vaccinology at the University of Oxford, She is the author of the book Vaxxers, the inside story of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the race against the virus. And I think that the fact that she authored that book tells you that Sarah was instrumental in developing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and we'll hear more about that in just a moment. On this side of me, Dr. Jerome Kim, who is Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, and next to Jerome, Holm Keller, who is Executive Chairman and CEO of the Kennup organization. It's a charitable foundation, and it's particularly right now focused on vaccine rollout in Africa and issues concerning vaccine equity around the world. So that's the panel. They're a fantastic bunch of people to discuss this issue, so please give them a very warm welcome. Now, Sarah, I want to kick off with you, if I may. As I've already indicated, you were front and center of a team that did amazing work. You know, as I tried to suggest at the beginning, back in the spring of 2020, there was a real fear it would take years and years to come up with a vaccine to combat this new threat of COVID-19. In fact, you and other teams too worked with phenomenal speed. So how would you characterize the challenge and the keys to your success?
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you to Wish for inviting me to come here and talk to you all this morning. My first time in Qatar. So what was really important in being able to move quickly in the pandemic was the platform technologies for making vaccines. And we've heard something about the mRNA vaccines this morning, which is a technology that's very adaptable. You can use it to quickly design a vaccine against a new pathogen. And then because you've done so much work on the technology itself, that makes it very rapid to get into clinical trials and through clinical testing. But the other platform technology that was really important from 2020 onwards, and the one that I work on, is Adnavaral vectored vaccines. So this is using a harmless version of a virus that normally infects our respiratory tract to turn it into a means of delivering the coding sequence for whichever gene sequence from the pathogen we choose to put into it, in very much the same way as we do with the RNA vaccines. Manufacturing is different. It's cheap to produce. It's able to be produced in very large quantities and stored at refrigerated temperatures. It doesn't need to be frozen, and that helps with vaccine distribution. So we've been working on that technology for a long time, and we've done quite a number of clinical trials using this adenoviral vector platform technology. So that was ready. We hadn't really prepared for going particularly quickly. We hadn't done a trial run. We knew that, in theory, we could go more quickly than we had done in the past, but we hadn't ever put that into practice. So we had to move quickly at the beginning of 2020 to work out how we could shorten our timelines. Another thing that was really important in getting off to a good start was the experience of the staff and the infrastructure that was available on our campus in Oxford, because it's one thing to design a vaccine in a lab. You very quickly have to get that into testing in animals, into GMP manufacturing, good manufacturing practice manufacturing, which is the standard that you have to work to if you want to take a vaccine into clinical trials. And we have our own manufacturing facility on campus, so we were able to repurpose that straight away and get into manufacturing in February of 2020. We have a clinical trial unit on site, and so we initiated our clinical trials in April of 2020. And we were able to put all of those pieces together because we already had the experience and the staff and the infrastructure as well as the vaccine technology. What then became extremely important was our partnership with a pharma company, with AstraZeneca. Because as a university, we were never going to be manufacturing and obtaining a marketing license and then selling this vaccine. We needed a partner who would do that with us. And it was very important to the university that this vaccine was to be made available to the world and without profit. And we found a pharma company who were prepared to work with us on those terms. We were very lucky to have AstraZeneca come on board, again in April of 2020, and they agreed to do what we wanted. And they did an absolutely superb job of working with 26 different manufacturing sites around the world to transfer our vaccine technology into those manufacturing sites so that it could be manufactured locally for local use. And again, it wasn't perfect. We weren't prepared for this. It could have gone better in some circumstances, but I think that sets a really good model for how we can get vaccines to the world. One university can make a seed stock of vaccine, and it can go to 26 different manufacturing sites around the world to be produced for local use. So that was also really important. And the last piece was the funding, because manufacturing vaccines doesn't come cheap. Running clinical trials, doing efficacy studies takes funding. And we were again lucky that the UK put together what it called the UK Vaccines Task Force, which supported not only our vaccine, but the development of many other vaccines, deliberately choosing to support many different technologies, multiple shots on goal, because it wasn't known at the beginning of 2020 which would be successful. As it turned out, many of them were. But the estimate when we started this work was probably only 1 in 7 was going to work. So we needed to have at least 7 in play to have a really good chance of getting something that was going to give us a vaccine that could be used. And so that task force funding that came through to us and enabled us to run the clinical trials and then partner with AstraZeneca for the manufacturing was really absolutely key to our ability to move quickly.
Well, that's all fascinating, and there's lots to unpick there. So just one quick thought for now. Do you think, given your reflections from here back, that we should now regard the process that you undertook, the partnerships you had, and the success of going from research lab to trials, to approval, to actually getting jabs in arms, all within a year? Do you think we should regard that as the new normal? Can we look forward to that sort of speed going forward for the next set of sort of vaccine challenges, the next pandemic, God help us?
Well, I think we should be ambitious. And as I said, we weren't perfectly prepared in any way, really, in 2020, and we had to move as quickly as possible. Now that we've done it, provided that we don't forget the lessons that we learnt, and provided we don't lose the investment in the manufacturing sites and the clinical trial sites, we should be able to move much more quickly next time. And I'm very...
More quickly than a year?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, let's be indulge your optimism.
Well, I mean, Richard, I'm sure will talk to you about CEPI's 100 Days mission, which is, I think, quite ambitious for a vaccine. If you're going to test vaccine efficacy, it does depend on how long it takes for your clinical trial to finish, and that depends on a number of different things. But certainly we could have got those trials started sooner. We should have been able to start them at the beginning of March, not the end of April.
Right.
And then we should have been able to roll out the manufacturing the vaccine for widespread use more quickly, because this was new. All of these different manufacturing sites had to come on board to receive the technology, to learn how to do things. Now that we have those sites, it doesn't take the same amount of time to do this again. And I would love to see a network of manufacturing sites in different parts of the world that are able to manufacture different types of vaccines and that are already prepared to do that when required, because that's how we can go quickly in getting large numbers of doses available.
Great. All right. Well, Sarah, for now, thank you very much. Jerome, I want to bring you in now. You're DG of the International Vaccine Institute, and I'm sure you've lent a lot of thought to this. I mean, if we're learning lessons from the last couple of years and from the way we've dealt with sort of vaccinating the world for COVID-19, how disease-specific do you think this entire period has been, or are there universalities here that can be applied to diseases and challenges that go far beyond coronavirus?
So that's a great question. And to some extent, as Sarah pointed out, we'd estimated 1 in 10 chance of success with a standard vaccine. So from laboratory to licensure, 93% rate of failure. So the fact that we had so many successes tells you something about the pathogen, COVID, as opposed to the pathogen HIV, which Sarah and I both have worked on, and we are no closer at this point to having a vaccine.
Right.
So the pathogen matters, but there are some other things in our response to endemic as well as pandemic diseases where we often fail. And to take stock of those, diagnostics. So there's a huge diagnostics gap, and it's resulted in Africa not being well represented in the mortality figures for COVID, but it also then is reflected in a lack of interest in COVID vaccination in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, because we're not sure actually how many people died. or if anybody died. So the diagnostics gap was important. The manufacturing gap, we've never made 10 billion to 12 billion doses of a similar type of vaccine, an anti-COVID vaccine, before. And so manufacturing was really remarkable, and it scaled up by mid-year, and we were starting to see significant output. But then the equity and access gap struck, and that was the bigger problem, because when you look, low-income countries around the world are still 80% unvaccinated.
Yeah.
And again, if we're thinking about responses, this is the equity gap and the access gap are problems that we see with standard vaccines. Rotavirus vaccine, introduced 16 years ago in the United States, 60% of the world's children have not been vaccinated. So as we take some of the innovations like COVAX or other things that we developed during the pandemic and start to think about the other diseases, I think there's a real opportunity there for there to be real progress in vaccinating a greater percentage of the world's children.
Yeah, so I think, in the course of this conversation, we're going to talk a lot about rollout, we're going to talk about equity, we're going to talk about a global approach rather than a national approach. But I do want to bring Richard in because I want to pick up very quickly on a thought that Sarah planted about, one lesson to be learned is that speed is possible in vaccine development, but you, Richard, and Seppi, you've sort of, as Sarah alluded to, you've become, to some eyes, wildly optimistic in thinking that, you can set a target of 100 days from beginnings of the science and the development of a vaccine to getting it rolled out. I mean, is that a viable target?
It's ambitious, but we do think it's viable. Sarah touched on some of the important elements, having prepared platforms, having prepared teams, having prepared networks that can respond rapidly, that are ready to go. I mean, look at what Sarah and her team accomplished from essentially, as you were describing it, more or less a cold start. Jerome talked about the anticipated success rate for vaccines when we started. He said 1 in 10. I think that would be an industry standard estimate. We actually didn't start from a cold start. Sarah's team, for example, was working on a MERS vaccine, a vaccine obviously very important to this region. And we had provided financial support to Sarah and to several other teams working on MERS vaccines because we need a MERS vaccine, but we also knew that coronavirus has presented a threat. And the reason we were able to respond so rapidly, Nubar mentioned that Moderna designed in silico a vaccine in 48 hours that was later shown to be about 95% effective, was because they had been working on a MERS vaccine, and they, and scientists like Sarah and others, had come to understand how to develop vaccines against coronaviruses, and that preparedness for the threat also was adapted very, very rapidly. In terms of delivering a vaccine in 100 days, we think there are 4 critical elements that will be required. The first is to compress the aspects of vaccine development, the phases of vaccine development that you must do to deliver a vaccine for use. The generation of a vaccine candidate, the early clinical trials to show safety and to gather immunogenicity data in human populations, those can be compressed if we have prepared teams, prepared networks, prepared institutions. We also think it will be critically important to distribute vaccine manufacturing capacity. Sarah talked about the tech transfer that was done. That had to be done in real time. The 26 facilities that produced the AstraZeneca vaccine did not have the ChAdOx technology already installed. They weren't ready to go. If we can have prepared manufacturing networks globally with access to rapid response technologies that can generate vaccines very quickly, then manufacturing can be scaled up much, much more efficiently. We also are going to need to change our paradigm for responding to really dangerous threats, where we have a highly transmissible but also a highly lethal pathogen. And that is going to mean a very careful calculation of risks and benefits, but a potential willingness to release vaccines for use at an earlier stage of their development than after a full phase 3 clinical trial. If we had delivered vaccines in 100 days in 2020, after the release of the sequences, we would have been delivering vaccines in April, not in December.
Yeah.
When the vaccines were released in December, there were already 70 million cases worldwide. And in point of fact, twice as many people died in 2021 as died in 2020. If we'd released them in April, there were only 3 million cases. And if they had been detected a month earlier, as Jerome was talking about the diagnostics, there were only 300,000 cases of COVID in March. So if we can prepare for the pathogens that we can anticipate, like coronaviruses, but also pathogens from other viral families, solve the problems of developing vaccines in advance, have prepared teams, institutions, and networks, and have a prepared and calibrated regulatory response that shifts when the threat is severe to allow earlier release of vaccine, we do think 100 days is feasible.
Well, I'm going to stop you there because you've just given the greatest illustration of why speed matters. It's about saving lives and preventing spread of illness, and we get that. Speed does matter. But speed isn't just a question of the science and developing the science and doing the trialing and the approvals and regulatory system. It's also then a profound challenge of logistics, country by country, to get those vaccinations delivered to clinics and into people's arms. So, Jimena, I want to bring you in. You were Minister of Health in Ecuador. You're still very involved with healthcare in Ecuador. Now, you're speaking from, an emerging economy perspective, a country which is in South America, far removed from most of the places where these vaccines were being developed. So talk me through how you tried to maximize efficiency once you could get the vaccines into your country, maximize the speed and efficiency of getting them to your people.
Well, what we did first was characterize the population in Ecuador. As you know, Ecuador is a very small country, 17.5 million people. It's a low-middle income country. But its population is very diverse. That's something important to have in mind. With indigenous people, communities that have the unique thoughts and also their language. I mean, everything is different in Ecuador. So having that in mind, we knew that we had to develop a very good logistic plan, a public health intervention proper to our community.
But just take me back a little bit before the thought of how to get the vaccines to the people. How easy was it for you as a national government to get your hands on adequate supplies of vaccine? Well,
it was kind of difficult. Well, we began to develop the plan even before we had the vaccines. It was months before to have the vaccines available for the country. We were already planning how to give the shots to the people. So when we went and arrived in the government, or the leadership or president and or chancellor was very important, trying to find out where to find vaccines in every place in the world, I think.
Did you use the COVAX system, and was it working?
Yes. Oh, no, it was not efficient. Let me tell that it was not enough efficient because we didn't have enough doses to give our population. And the challenge for our government was to vaccinate 9 million people in 100 days. So we did need.
So that's you wanted to get half the population, at least their first vaccine, within 100 days.
Exactly.
And did you do it?
We did, with 2 vaccines, with the complete scheme of vaccination.
Ah, okay.
In 98 days, 2 doses. So we didn't restrain or search for vaccines to just one type of vaccines, and not either from one country or 2 countries. We were looking to many countries to find out where we can find the vaccines that we need, and we did. So the matter was that we include every Ecuadorian in that plan. So the army forces were included.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Health, of course, the central government, universities, police, fire workers, Red Cross, everybody was involved. The private sector was very important.
Did you find much public resistance at the beginning to vaccination?
No, not at the beginning, because everybody was eager for the vaccines.
Right.
As you know, Ecuador was suffering a lot at the beginning of the pandemics. We had 75,000 deaths in excess during the pandemics. And Ecuador was in the news, in the world news, because our people was dying in the streets.
Indeed, and neighboring Peru had one of the worst, I think, per capita mortality rates in the world for COVID.
And Ecuador was almost the same.
Yeah, so you knew that this was one heck of a big challenge, and the danger was very real. So as you reflect on it now from October 2022, what do you think, be brief, but what do you think you got right and what did you get wrong?
Well, the first thing that we did right, I think it was our government or president was negotiating the vaccines directly government to government. There was no intermediator in the negotiation. The second thing is that we involved all the stakeholders in the health system in Ecuador. So everybody was involved, the private and the public sector. The other thing is that we had a very good communication system in which everybody was aware that the government was doing their responsibility to have enough vaccines for the people, and people was also aware that they had to have the vaccines. So that's why we could vaccinate so many people in so a short time. So I think that tackle that we made with the vaccination, that huge effort with the vaccination for so many people, just stopped the pandemic.
Right, and in terms of lessons learned and something that wasn't right and which you can now see you need to get right for next time, what would that be?
Well, the first thing, to have the vaccines. I think that
just pure availability. Well, I'm going to stop you there then, because I'm going to bring Holm in now, because Holm, your NGO is working very hard, and I think you're focused particularly on Africa to ensure that precisely that lesson learned about fundamental availability of vaccine, particularly in the poorer parts of the world, and I know you focus a lot on Africa, that we are better prepared for the next big challenge. So how are you going about that?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. We believe, and this is also very well written in the report that was published to accompany this conference, that pandemic preparedness requires local manufacturing. So one of the things we do as a charity, we work with our clients. One of them is BioNTech, another one is Recipharm, to establish meaningful manufacturing structures on, let's start there, the African continent. And what that means is you need more modular, smaller technological units to break the rule of law of economy of scale in vaccine manufacturing. You need to work with the national regulatory agencies, because actually regulatory systems and regulatory science has evolved tremendously. It's just difficult to deploy it in complex organizations like the African Union and in many member states who don't have ML3 regulators.
But to put it bluntly, is big pharma, which is sort of what we're talking about in terms of the leaders in sort of vaccine manufacture, are they prepared to invest, build, plant in Africa, for example?
I think the term big pharma is not a good one. I mean, as you can see, most, if not all, relevant COVID vaccines were not developed by big pharma. That's
So,
interesting.
okay, so you're working
So
with BioNTech. You wouldn't
we are
call
working with
BioNTech.
BioNTech. It's not big pharma.
Okay.
It's obviously Moderna is not big pharma. Oxford is not big pharma.
No, but also Oxford, as Sarah said,
Novavax
relied
is
upon
not-
a great partnership with AstraZeneca, which most definitely is big pharma.
Yeah, I think the discussion is not so much about big pharma. The discussion is about empowering people and empowering societies to take care of these unnecessarily ultra-complex systems. And that's what we are trying. So our client BioNTech has just broken ground in Rwanda for Africa's first mRNA drug substance and drug product factory. Another factory in Senegal and one in South Africa are coming up.
So those are commitments made and the building work is...
There's construction work going on.
Right.
It's beyond maybe.
Right.
It's happening. You'll see manufacturing in Rwanda in 2023. And the same is true for fill and finish. Recipharm is here taking a big lead on the African continent following the leadership of the King of Morocco, where a state-of-the-art massive facility is being built. And these facilities together create a network allowing several platforms to evolve. There's mRNA manufacturing with BioNTech alone having vaccine candidates in malaria, in tuberculosis, and hopefully soon in HIV to come to the clinic, which are the three biggest African killer diseases. And it's obvious that if those make it to the market, they need to be manufactured in Africa. And with those, also other platforms have evolved. And this is, Sarah pointed this out very eloquently in the beginning. This is maybe the biggest benefit the world has taken out of that pandemic, is the standardization of vaccine development and manufacturing platforms, which comes with regulatory capability building, comes with industrial manufacturing regulatory capability building, human resources pool capability building. So this will pay into Richard's 100 days more significantly than anything else.
Well, I must say that everything you've just said is very positive and suggests that, you know, going forward, things for the next big disease challenge may be better, and that, for example, in Africa, there may be more capability to develop a very quick response in terms of manufacturing vaccine in situ.
I mean, let's not forget the three big African killer diseases, infectious killer diseases. There are no second-generation vaccines yet. Right. Malaria has a wonderful first-generation vaccine on TB, VHPCG, which is okay, but is only part of the equation. On HIV, we have positively nothing. So there is ongoing, pandemics, we don't have to wait for disease X to hit. And this is also part of the business system thinking for building African manufacturing now. Right. It's not only pandemic preparedness, it's the suffering that is currently going on where industry structure, a timeline thinking that would have been different had the diseases been prevalent in Europe or in the US, and a general negative industry bias to prevention over treatment have not really led to solutions. And I think this, thanks to the work of these wonderful colleagues here, has changed during the course of the pandemic. Okay. And the last cornerstone here is really to diversify manufacturing, to make sure that politics can't get involved in uptake.
Well, I want to talk politics a little more in a moment. But before I do that, we've now heard from all of our panel, and they've given us different perspectives, different insights into both the COVID challenge and how we can learn the right lessons from it. Does anybody at this point want to put up a hand and ask a question? Because this is absolutely designed to be interactive, and we would love to get your questions throughout the session, not just at the very end. Great, we've got some already. So roving mics are available. You, sir, you're nearest the roving mic, and then I'll come to you. But you, sir, first.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Fascinating discussion. Anupam Sibal, Group Medical Director of Apollo Hospitals in India. Given the fact that every sixth human being lives in India, I think I'd like to share the Indian perspective. We've given 2.18 billion doses of vaccines. And there was a lot of talk about how can we make this equitable. Cost is crucial. The cost of the vaccine in India is $2.80. And we did push out 254 million vaccines to 101 countries because we in India have always believed in Vasudev Kutumbakam, which means the world is one family, and it took COVID for the world to realize that. So I think this is an example of how we can collaborate going forward in terms of scaling up, building capacity, and actually sharing expertise at a cost that's truly affordable. I think the great work done by Oxford and the manufacturer in India was largely responsible for these 254 million vaccines going out.
Yeah, no, it's inspiring. I mean, did you say 2 billion vaccines?
Yes, we've given 2.18 billion as of 10 minutes ago. Because we have an app that updates every minute.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. And thanks for the thought from India. There was a gentleman over here. Let's get the microphone over here. All right. Thanks for your patience, sir. Tell us who you are and give us your question.
So my name is Walid Al-Wali. I'm a consultant microbiologist, vice chair of the laboratories of the Hamid Medical Corporation. I've got a very general question. First, all the discussions, presentations, are fantastic and absolutely inspiring. Regarding the COVID pandemic, the amount of vaccine that we had, COVID, was enough for every single human being to be vaccinated on the globe.
Yeah.
Yet that did not happen.
And it still hasn't anything like happened. Yeah.
Absolutely. So my question is for the coming pandemics, God forbid they will not happen, will the same situation happen? And what on earth do we need to do to ensure that every human being, particularly in impoverished, deprived areas, will get the vaccine?
Oh my God, sir, what a brilliant, succinct question. If I could have planted somebody to ask that question, I would have. But I didn't plant you, but nonetheless, I'm delighted you asked it. And I want various people to respond. Sarah, you haven't spoken for a while, so you respond first, then we'll get other responses.
Thank you. So I think broadly we had three phases of waiting for vaccines to get to people. Firstly, we didn't have any vaccines and know if we ever would have any vaccines, and that was solved within a year. Then we had to ramp up manufacturing capability, and that was slow because the facilities weren't ready. They were being ramped up while the vaccines were being tested, but it still took some time after vaccines had approvals to have large numbers of doses available. And then the third challenge, which we still haven't solved, is the capacity of low-income countries to vaccinate, particularly their adult populations, because there are not systems in place to get vaccines into people's arms. Even countries that have good pediatric vaccination programs may not have any regular vaccination of adults. And to set that up very quickly, Ecuador clearly managed this very well, but many countries didn't have the facilities to do this. And that's something that still needs to be addressed, because from January of this year, there wasn't a shortage of vaccine doses. There was a lack of capacity for countries to use the doses that were becoming available. And so that still needs to be addressed. And maybe one way of looking at it is that we know influenza A will always come back and cause another pandemic. And if we start to prepare for that by having annual vaccination programs of at least the older adults in every country with influenza vaccines, that enables the infrastructure to be put into place to have these mass vaccination campaigns in the future, should they be needed for a different pandemic.
So when you say, Sarah, that there is no shortage of vaccine anywhere in the world, you're saying that there is no government that is unable to vaccinate its population because it can't get supplies?
From the beginning of the year, manufacturing facilities started to reduce their output because it wasn't being taken up.
And yet we know, I can't remember who said it, but we know that vaccination rates in many countries in Africa are still extraordinarily low. So how do we tackle that? Assuming we all believe that those people who haven't been vaccinated, those adults who haven't been vaccinated should be vaccinated, how do we tackle that problem? Jerome?
So thanks. To follow up with Sarah and to put some numbers, the birth cohort, so the number of children born every year in the world, is about 130 to 140 million. We vaccinate 80% of them, which is good, actually a significant improvement. 2.5 million children are alive every year because of that effort to vaccinate. The problem is the adult we consider the entire population, it's 8 billion. So the health systems that are struggling to deliver to the 80% are really going to have a problem when we tell them, and now you have to vaccinate their brothers and sisters, their moms and dads, and their grandparents. And that's the challenge. So this strengthening of health systems around the world is critical, not only for vaccination.
Yeah.
It would have massive additional benefit for the health of populations around the world, with regard to problems induced by climate change and other things.
I mean, this is just a basic question in the end, which is not specifically about vaccines. It's about how to improve in the lower income countries, the poorer, disadvantaged parts of the world, how to improve basic healthcare infrastructures.
Right. And there's a second component. We had a global consensus on the value of vaccination. That's how Gavi was formed. That's why UNICEF does these bulk purchases. That's how we've achieved 80% vaccination. And one of the things that the dreadful politics of COVID has done is it's partially fractured that. I mean, there are places in Africa where healthcare workers don't want to take the vaccine because they've had 18 months of negative publicity about the harm of vaccination and not the benefit of vaccination. So as we forge or reforge the global consensus around the benefits of vaccination, we really have to begin to address those issues that are keeping people from wanting to be vaccinated. And the last part is, when we look at this, the countries that have the lowest per capita spending on health are the ones that are going to be disproportionately affected by a requirement to vaccinate the entire population. So the health budget of Mali, 40% of it would be used to vaccinate the adult population. And we have to think about that as we roll these out.
All right. Holm, go on quick. Yep.
Yeah, super quick. I think there's one simple answer to your question, and the Indian interaction is part of this. In order to better address low and middle income country needs in the next pandemic, we need to manufacture regionally. We forget that India Serum Institute was sitting on massive number of doses of Cervar's vaccine. Mr. Poonawalla and team were happy to sell it, have sold it, but politically it was blocked from exiting the subcontinent. This is one of the main reasons why COVAX ran into these issues.
Right.
And we are not going to overcome it by contracts. We are only going to overcome it by empowerment of regions.
So, Holm, that's an interesting point, because we can't ignore, I mean, I'm a journalist and I always look for sort of the problems, not just the solutions. And one of the problems here, surely, that we've learned from COVID is about global politics and about the degree to which, there isn't a global leadership which can truly cooperate to meet a challenge like this. We saw far too much sort of nationalism. I think the phrase vaccine nationalism emerged, in 2020 as countries scrabbled to ensure they got their contracts for vaccine before anybody else did. Even it wasn't just like the rich world wasn't really even beginning to think about taking care of the needs of the poor world. It was that the EU and Britain were having a big fight about whether Britain should be allowed to import vaccines that it had contracted to buy from European manufacturers. And that was a big fight. And China, of course, was another big issue, partly because of complicated discussions about how the coronavirus arrived on our planet in the first place, and mutual suspicions, and that dogged the WHO. Global politics is a big problem here, is it not? And do you think there's any sign post the COVID crisis that we know how to develop a better geopolitical collaborative leadership?
Let me pick up on a point to answer your question. Let me pick up on a point that Holm made, which is that countries have to take care of their own populations. I think all of us accept that national leaders have a responsibility to their own populations. The fundamental cause of the inequity that we saw emerge in 2021, the fundamental causes were structural. They were the concentration of vaccine manufacturing capacity in a few regions that politically had to take care of their own populations, and the problems with delivery in countries where healthcare systems are not adequate to deliver vaccines to their populations. And so, to answer your question, and to pick up on a point that Peter Sands made in the first session, when he said you have to start with equity. You have to start with what would a system that could produce the equitable distribution of vaccine globally look like? It would be a system where manufacturing is globally distributed and where regions are self-sufficient and have access to the rapid response technologies, building on the kinds of tech transfer that took place during the pandemic. And it would be a system where healthcare systems are strong in all countries and able to deliver vaccines rapidly in a crisis. Jimena and I were talking right before we came on stage about the experience in Ecuador. Ecuador was devastated by the early waves of the pandemic. Jimena mentioned people dying in the streets, literally in Guayaquil. And after they had vaccine, after they delivered the vaccine, I think you said that the pandemic subsided very rapidly. And so we need to build that system that can produce equitable outcomes because the current system cannot.
Yeah, well, I'd like to hear Jimena's thought on that, and then...
Yes. Well, I think it's not so difficult to improve the health system to deliver vaccines inside of the countries. Indeed, the health system in Ecuador was very weak at the beginning of the pandemics. But we realized that we had to have, first of all, a very technical plan to deliver the vaccines to all the population, with equity. And that the leadership of our government was very important. That was very important. Second of all, we were including all the stakeholders inside of our plan to deliver the vaccination. And that was also very key.
It's not just about vaccination, though, is it? It's also about, for example, the availability of PPE, of protective equipment, of the basics. You know, I mean, masks saved an awful lot of lives.
You remember that there was a scarce of everything. I mean, we didn't have enough syringes or alcohol or face masks or gloves.
So my question, again, when we're talking about global equity, and we've already heard about the importance of establishing real sort of manufacturing capability in lower income countries, and we heard about initiatives in Africa, it's got to be more than just that. It's also got to be other forms of infrastructure, including rolling out PPE and making sure that countries are better equipped around the world for the next...
For example, we didn't have ultra-cold freezers, but we have donations. That's where private enterprises are very important too. The private investment in vaccination process was very important in Ecuador too, because they were donating us face masks, PPEs, and ultra-cold freezers, everything that we needed, and also logistics like chairs and computers, people who was getting inside the information inside of the system. I mean, everybody was just helping to get the vaccines and also giving the shots to everybody.
Right. I'm getting questions coming in off the app as well, and do wave your arms if you've got more questions. So let's deal with these quickly, because we don't have that much time, and I do love it when people have got questions coming in. We'll get as many dealt with as we can. One question is, how much of a barrier, looking forwards to developing, you know, the best possible global infrastructure we can to beat pandemics, how much of a barrier is the navigation, this is the way it's put, the navigation of commercial interests when we talk about the need to develop manufacturing and distribution on a global scale? The profit motive, you know, is that a complicating factor? I mean, we are all aware, I guess, that some of the big companies involved in developing the COVID vaccine are now sort of launching lawsuits against each other, pursuing intellectual property right disputes, which is an indicator that we're not just talking about the public good here, we're also talking about the profit motive. Is the profit motive going to be a problem, a hurdle to getting the best global systems we can?
I think it's not. It's a minimal factor. As long as the system is designed to allow private investment and to allow private investment to recoup, the new players in this industry, and we have heard some of these names are all looking at different margins than conventional oncological therapies in big pharma need to deliver. And there is a new industry evolving, which is much more modular, granular, platform-based, less universal, but more targeted. And with that, I think it's a new evolvement of entrepreneurial capabilities hand in hand with public health. So this is a good time that has been started.
That's the very positive spin. Sarah, you work, essentially in academia, but you've been very closely partnered with a very big global pharmaceutical company. What's your take on the role of the profit motive?
Well, I think it's very complicated, and we should look to what's happening in a pandemic and what's happening for the future preparedness for the next pandemic with a slightly different view. If we're going to have these new manufacturing facilities in Africa and in other regions of the world, those have to be kept running. There's no good building them. They have to be staffed. The staff have to be trained. The equipment has to work, and that means they have to be producing something. So what I would really like to see now is for those new manufacturing facilities to be producing vaccines for use in the local region, and for those companies who run those facilities to be able to make an adequate profit on those vaccines to keep their facilities running. And that benefits everybody, because it means that there are new companies producing vaccines for the local population which will benefit from those. But then if there is another pandemic, they can switch to manufacturing the pandemic vaccine, and then that helps the whole world by being able to get capacity there really quickly.
Yeah.
So I think we shouldn't be thinking about all of the vaccines made without profit. We should be thinking about how to support the manufacturing industry, the vaccine manufacturing industry, so that we have manufacture of a lot of different vaccines to support public health.
Talking about manufacturing capacity in lower income countries, BioNTech, and I've learned a little bit about this morning, are developing this idea of, I think they call it the biotainer, where they essentially kind of build a lab or a production facility in kit parts, and then, as they are doing, shipping it out to, for example, Rwanda, to establish a facility there. As a scientist, do you think there's great potential in that approach?
That means that you will be able to have a very standardized production process, which is good. That means the regulators will see the vaccine produced in the facilities as the same produced elsewhere. You're still going to need highly experienced local staff, though, to run those facilities, to do the testing of the vaccines. Every batch has to be tested for quality before it can be used. So we need to put some resource into really high quality training of those people who are going to work in those facilities. And I know that in South Korea there's a big initiative to have training of staff from low-income countries to be able to do this vaccine manufacturing.
All right, quickly, Hom, because there's lots more to get through.
Maybe very quick to add, the key staffing challenge is on the regulator side. Batch release has to be done in conjunction with the NIAs.
Yeah.
If they are not equipped, so this is also where you are very active. On BioNTech side, I can only tell the African Union and the Republic of Rwanda have started a biomanufacturing training institute, which works with many, many players internationally, and this is indeed important because you only make a sustainable tech transfer if staffing is done locally. And in the end, it reaches out into local academia, and also product development efforts are partnered.
Right. Right, I'm going to scan the room. There's lots of hands up, so we're going to struggle to get them all in. But where's the microphone near? There's a microphone near you, sir, so we'll get to you first, and then we'll go to others. Be brief, if you would, and give us your name.
My name is Shahid. I'm from Oxford. My question is about regulatory systems. It seems different countries follow different regulatory systems. Can we agree on a global regulatory system?
Yeah, well, that's a very important question. Is there any prospect of a global, universal regulatory system?
WHO plays a very important role in looking at products that are regulated by what are called stringent regulatory authorities, and in sharing that information with developing countries. A global regulatory system is probably not a near-term prospect. Let me put it that way. But I do think the experience of the pandemic has shown the value of harmonization around emergency protocols and emergency authorization. And there is a lot of ongoing work right now to try to move towards more harmonized, if not global, systems.
I'm going to be disciplined and say, for most questions, we'll just take one panel response and then we'll move on, because then we can get more questions in before the end of our session. I know there was, oh yes, you sir, you had your hand up, and then there was one over here, yeah. So actually you've got the mic, so ma'am, you go, and then sir, you go, but yeah.
Thank you. Ruth Stringer, Healthcare Without Harm. First of all, my gratitude and admiration to everyone who helped produce the vaccine and roll it out. But people have talked about the PPE, about the need for local manufacturing, and the importance of roll-up, having a full integrated system. But no one yet has been talking about how we deal with the waste from all of this manufacturing and what happens after to the syringes and the vials after they've been delivered. They can be recycled, but the systems aren't there. Next month we've got COP27, and then at the end of November we've got the first negotiating session for a treaty on global plastics pollution. How do we make this all add up? Because we can't have healthy people on a sick planet.
Yeah, well, it is a reminder that we're addressing sort of pandemic this morning, but there are other sort of existential global challenges out there, and we don't want to create another problem in trying to solve one. So, Jerome, you look like you're primed to respond.
So quickly, actually, we had a brief discussion about this yesterday, but it's an important problem. It's going to take a little bit of time in order to get through systems that are more convenient, easier to dispose of, that have less volume of waste. But I think that, again, that this can be framed in terms of a green initiative for pharmaceutical and manufacturing companies. And, you know, like all the other things that are going to be zero carbon and minimal footprint, this is something that we need to work on as a priority, and something that companies are already talking about, but they're not making much progress, and I think the activities of COP27 may be very important.
Holm, I'm going to be a very decisive and rude chairman and say, no, I can't be doing with a response because I want to get more questions in and there are other topics. So, sorry, but you, sir.
There. I'm Mark Lockridge. I'm a senior associate at advisory firm Global Counsel. I just wanted to ask if there's maybe a lesson we can learn from Qatar itself in all this, in building highly resilient regional hubs and be able to distribute a lot of these vaccines. We know that Qatar has Qatar Airways, it has the network of free zones. With all these geopolitical tensions and black swan events, I mean, Qatar's had to deal with a blockade as well. Is that a good model to be able to distribute vaccines regionally, having these highly resilient hubs?
Anybody know enough about what Qatar's been doing to give a quick response to that?
Very quickly, just to say that I think regional hubs and regional supply chains, regional manufacturing, and regional distribution capabilities will absolutely be critical. And they are part of that system that is designed to produce equitable outcomes.
Okay, thanks. A question has come in on the app. A new malaria vaccine, and this is now, because we're close to closing the session, and I do want to look forward. A new malaria vaccine was in the news recently. Are there other diseases, panel, which you think have promising vaccine work in the pipeline where, you know, within the foreseeable future, we may be looking at important new vaccines for some of the world's, you know, worst diseases?
Well, what really interests me is developing vaccines against all the, what we call emerging pathogens, things like Ebola, Rift Valley fever virus, chikungunya, things that cause outbreaks, and we don't have vaccines against them. We did then have a vaccine against Ebola Zaire strain, but there's now an Ebola Sudan outbreak in Uganda, and we don't have a vaccine for that. And we could have had a vaccine because we know how to make a vaccine against Ebola viruses. Right. So there's a lot of vaccines which are part way through development, some supported by CEPI. We need to finish the job and have stockpiles of those vaccines so that should there be an outbreak, we can respond really quickly and prevent that outbreak from spreading.
I broaden that a little bit.
Quick.
So, you know, the outbreak diseases are very important. But let's remember that poverty-associated infectious diseases kill 4 to 5 million people a year. So it starts with HIV, TB, and malaria, but it goes down to group A strep, Shigella, Salmonella, a host of diseases for which vaccine solutions don't exist. Why? Because these are low and middle income country diseases. There's not a big pharma company. There's market failure in this vaccine. There's a $1 billion gap in funding vaccines for poverty-associated infectious diseases, and that's going to be a challenge. It's going to require leadership and thought about how we position these, and they're ideal vaccines for manufactured by regional manufacturers because these are regional problems. And so when we think about sustainable manufacturing, we can think about ways to develop vaccines for the other diseases, the diseases that exist in low and middle income countries, as an example of a way forward.
And what about, I mean, is it even worth just a nod to non-infectious diseases, like, vaccines for cancer? I mean, is that something that we really need to take seriously?
I think you'll hear from the BioNTech founders tomorrow, but part of the idea of African manufacturing on an mRNA platform is that the upcoming therapeutic vaccines in oncology will be made available to the African patient. At the same time, it will become available to European and US patients. So this will...
It's an exciting field, generally. Go on, Jerome, quick, because we're unfortunately going to have to wrap in a moment.
And there are 3 vaccines that we could develop that will stop cancer. I mean, HPV is already developed. Helicobacter pylori, which is associated with gastric cancer, and of course the hepatitis B vaccine associated with the prevention of hepatocellular cancer. So there's a lot of progress that we can make for vaccines for infectious diseases that are associated with cancer.
All right. Well, sadly, we're almost at, well, we are out of time, but I'm going to end just by asking each member of our panel, it's not exactly a yes-no answer, but I want a very brief answer. We've talked about what happened in the COVID crisis and the challenge and how we met it. I don't think anybody doubts there's going to be a pandemic coming down the track before too long. I mean, some people refer to disease X. We don't quite know how it's going to pan out, but the challenge is still out there. Do you, panel, believe that we will respond to the next pandemic with greater scientific speed, although as Sarah said, it was pretty amazing this time around, but is the speed going to be there and the response time quicker? And more fundamentally, will the response next time be more collaborative and ultimately more equitable, looking at it on a sort of global context? So it doesn't have to be yes, no, but it has to be a very brief response from each of you. Richard, we'll start with you and go down the panel.
Short answer. I'm optimistic that we will respond more quickly and more effectively next time. I am concerned that political leaders will lose their focus on pandemic threats because of all of the other crises that they are facing. And those crises have their roots in the pandemic and the disruption it caused, so they cannot take their eye off of this threat.
Interesting thought. Jimena.
I really hope so. I really hope that everybody is going to be more collaborative, and also there will be more equity in the whole world. And of course, I think that, for example, South America is going to be better prepared for the next pandemic.
You're sure you will be better prepared?
Yes, Ecuador is going to be better prepared, but South America is going to be better too.
Good. All right. Sarah.
Well, I think we've made many scientific and technical advances. We've learned about the logistics. We know what we need to do. We could do it better next time. There are so many other demands on funding, though. We're already seeing investment moving away from pandemic preparedness, and my concern is that a few years down the line, we may have forgotten some of the lessons that we know to be so important now.
Thank you. Jerome?
So I think if you think about how a vaccine is developed, prove it, make it in significant quantity, then use it. We're actually faster at proving it and making it, but it's the using it. The thing that makes a vaccine effective is vaccination. And until we can ensure vaccination and effective, efficient vaccination, then we are going to have problems in the next pandemic response.
And Hon?
Yeah, on this one, I am not optimistic. The monkeypox case has shown that it depends on who is affected first.
Right. Well, we've had We've had a degree of positivity, but we've had some important skepticism as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we've run over by a couple of minutes. I've robbed you of a couple of minutes of lunchtime, but I hope you'll agree I did it because our panel is so interesting. We've had so many insights and such a brilliant discussion. So thank you, panelists. Thank you for being here. Enjoy your lunch, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.